Yeah, I see some discussion in the chat. Does everybody get what the connection is? Everybody get why? Somebody tell me why we played that song. David Kurtz knows, because that is by the great 70s rock band Jethro Tull, and we're going to be talking about Jethro today. So that's good opportunity to dive back into progressive rock. Okay, so Jethro, Yitro in Hebrew, Parsha Yitro, is named for Jethro. And I mean, it might be the most important Parsha in the whole Torah, right? Like, this is the Parsha that has the story of the Torah in it, so to speak, right? This is the Parsha with the revelation. This is the Parsha with the event at Mount Sinai that our tradition has come to see as the source for the Torah itself, the whole Torah. So it's a big deal, big deal this week. And let's say a blessing over this momentous occasion of thanking God for this opportunity to once again consider the great event. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so the great event, the revelation, the thing that the whole religion is based on, right? Like, in some ways, Judaism is central faith claim. If you're going to talk, dogma, and that's, there's no real dogma in Judaism. But if you're going to say Judaism had a central faith claim, it would not be that there is a God. Yeah, we say that, but other religions say that too, and that's not the thing that we keep harping on. The thing we keep harping on is that there was this big event at Mount Sinai, and that God gave us the Torah, and that's the deal, that we had some kind of contact with God, and we have a message. So that's the big event, and that's what we should talk about. And 10 Commandments. I mean, it's there's so much to say there, and yet first we have to consider the story of Jethro, because this Parsha, I've already said, is named after, my TV just froze. Did you hear me? Yeah. This Parsha is TV. This Parsha is named after Jethro. It starts with the story of Jethro, and there's this way in which the whole revelation is framed and named through Jethro. Now, who is Jethro? Many of you probably remember that Jethro is Moses's father-in-law. Although that's already complicated because there's like different names used for Jethro throughout the Torah, right? So there are lots of characters in the Torah with a couple of names, but Jethro has a lot. And so I know that my biblical critic friends out there are ready to pounce, and that's fine. That is one of the ways of looking at that is that, they're different stories of who Moses' father-in-law was, and these are different fragments. We'll keep that in mind. But as you know, my orientation is to try and synthesize, try to sort of see what are all these different fragments of Jethro's story, and that's what we're going to try and do today. Try to understand the purpose of Jethro's story, but in particular today, I want to focus on Jethro's entrance and exit. Like, why is Jethro showing up all of a sudden? And then where does he go? Because at a certain point, he seems to take off. And those questions, I think, will help us understand better the meaning, the deep significance of Jethro's story altogether, which I should summarize before we even begin. I should just give us a sense of what actually happens in Jethro's story. And I'll just do that very quickly. But again, then I'm going to pause us, and without thinking about it too much, we're going to look at the question of why Jethro's there altogether. Okay, so here in the chat, I'm going to put our sources for today. There's a link to the source sheet. And I just want to quickly, we'll look at these texts in greater depth, but I want to just quickly reference a couple of the main chunks here. We really should read all of chapter 18, all of the chapter that Jethro, the Parshat Yitro begins with. But we'll try and just sort of excerpt. And we begin by saying that Jethro, by Yishma Yitro, priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, God's people, how the Eternal had brought Israel out from Egypt. And so Jethro comes along, takes Zipporah, Moses' wife, after she had been sent home, meaning we have to account for that because she initially came with Moses back to Egypt. But anyway, Jethro comes back and like after hearing about everything that happened, and Jethro shows up, and Jethro's very happy and Jethro celebrates. But the other part that I want to read is the famous the real significance of the Jethro story is that Jethro then sees Moses acting as a judge over the people, settling all the people's disputes. And the story is apparently that they're in this long line, right? Just like imagine all the people just in this long line all day, and they come one after another, and Moses just sits there and answers their questions one after another. And Jethro says, this is no way to run a society. And he says, and this is the great kind of Jethro speech, the thing you are doing, he says, is not right. You will surely wear yourself out, and these people as well. For the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You represent the people before God. You bring the disputes before God, and enjoin upon them the laws and the teachings, and make known to them the way they are to go and the practices they are to follow. You shall also seek out from among all the people capable men who fear God, trustworthy men who spurn ill-gotten gain. Set these over them as chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, and let them judge the people at all times. Have them bring every major dispute to you, but let them decide every minor dispute themselves. Make it easier for yourself by letting them share the burden with you. If you do this, and God so commands you, you will be able to bear up, and all of these people will go home unwearied. And then critically, Moses heeded his father-in-law and did just what he said. Okay? So that's the information you need kind of in the back of your head here, is that Jethro shows up. He sees that this is not a good way to run a society, and specifically, this is not a good way to settle disputes, to judge among the people. What Moses seems to be doing at this moment, which is just judging them all himself. And Jethro gives Moses advice, not just advice, but a whole system that Moses apparently takes on. Okay, so at this point, we could and should begin to ask the question, oh, so why do we learn about this whole system right before the revelation? Right? Like, what is this doing here? What does this whole judicial system have to do with, and there's lots to say about why we might want to think about these things before we get the law. Lots to say there. And of course, I must also say, before we get to our real question today, that it seems that the part of the point is that part of the significance of this story is that Jethro is not an Israelite, right? Jethro is not Jewish. And that seems like a big part of the deal here, is that Moses' father-in-law from elsewhere, a priest of Midian, comes in and gives advice, and we take that advice. So that's also part of what needs to be processed and reflected upon whenever we turn to the story of Jethro. Okay, that all is background. Now I want to just ask the two big questions of the day, which is, why is Jethro showing up now? And where does Jethro go after this? Okay, and in order to ask them, let's just start with that first line again, that Jethro heard something, right? Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, Vayishma Yitro Kohen Midian, Choten Moshe, et kol asher asa Elohim leMoshe uLiYisrael amo, ki hotzi Adonai et Yisrael miMitzrayim. Heard all that God had done for Moses and Israel, God's people, how the Eternal had brought Israel out from Egypt. Okay, so what did Jethro hear? I leave it to you to kind of think, speculate, and why is he showing up? There are some straightforward answers, but things will get complicated quickly. So let's just start there. What did Jethro hear? What suddenly prompts Jethro to show up at this moment? Someone wanna? answer for us? Hiro. Nice to see you, Hiro.
Thank you. Well, first of all, he's Moses' father-in-law, so Zipporah and the children are living with him, and so I'm sure he has an interest of getting them back to Moses. And being a man of power, he also would be interested in political developments in the area. So of course he's keeping track of what's going on.
Okay, great. So there's an explicit reason that Jethro shows up. Hiro's exactly right. And the text says, so to bring Zipporah and Moses' children back. Apparently, and it makes sense, if Moses is leading the revolution, it makes sense that he would have said, oh, wife and kids should go back, and my father-in-law is a great guy. He'll certainly take care of them. And now they've exited, right? They're out. And so Jethro's heard about it. And Hiro adds, Jethro is a man of power and influence in the region. So he also is just keeping track, but he has a kind of a personal reason, and also just as a leader in the area, he wants to kind of update. Oh, wow! So you overthrew Pharaoh and you made it out of Egypt. Let's get the update, but also now you can reunite as a family. Okay, anything else, Noah?
Yeah, I think following in what Hiro said, but I'm also adding that we got like 7 or 8 names for Jethro throughout the Bible. So he's a well-known priest in Midian. He knows all the happenings that's going on in the region, but also he might be wanting, I don't know why he has so many names, but he could be wanting to just move with the big group of people that have just overthrown this great empire, and now he's giving some advice and wants to be in that group because for whatever reason he feels where he's living in Midian at the moment isn't so welcoming. That might be another reason.
Yeah, okay, great. Meaning, and I think Noah's picking up on the sort of political machinations that Hiro was imagining, where Jethro sees, oh, this is like the whole region is shifting, and I need to I'm glad I picked this is my mechutin, because I'm going to ally with these people, right? That they've just something's going well with them, and indeed one of the classic rabbinic running narratives is the sort of the treatment of Jethro as a kind of a growing convert to Israel. In other words, Jethro is someone who clearly is an ally, and so the rabbis imagine that he's becoming religiously inspired and eventually will convert to Judaism, right? Convert to, I don't know, it wasn't Judaism back then, Torahism. Okay, so that all of that, what Hiro and Noah have done has been very helpful in imagining why Jethro at this moment in the narrative, meaning they just exited Egypt, and Jethro suddenly shows up. What's he doing at this moment? Fine, and that's reasonable, and also would allow us to think about. So again, why does Jethro's advice get included here before the revelation, and what do we do with this? Like, what is the meaning of the story of this outsider comes to give the very framework through which we will be able to receive and adjudicate the laws?
Good idea.
But there's a problem. But there's a problem, okay? And the problem is that, first of all, it does seem like a little like bit of an interruption, this story, but there are also good reasons to imagine that this story didn't take place at this moment. And the Ibn Ezra will do some of that work for us, one of our great medieval commentators, the Ibn Ezra. I'm just going to excerpt a bit of he does a huge analysis of this story, synthesizing all the different parts that we're going to look at today. But I just want to look at the beginning, because he immediately makes a very strong point that and then quickly adds some details that once you read it, I don't know, you immediately reconsider the timeline of Jethro's story. At least I did. So take a look here. So the Ibn Ezra says, Jethro heard. I should bold this right here. Jethro heard. This is the Dibur Matchil. Jethro heard. So what did Jethro hear? Well, Jethro, I guess, heard about the Exodus, right? But the Ibn Ezra notes that just above, meaning in the last Parsha, Parsha Bashalach, the last thing we read was the incident with Amalek. The last thing we read, let's just take a look at this, shall we? Just because this is what's nice about Sefaria is that we can do this. Let's just take a look at what the Ibn Ezra says here. Here's the Jethro story. And if we go back, the last story we read was the story of Amalek. And they came. And what the Ibn Ezra notices is that they came and they fought with Israel at a place called Rephidim. Rephidim, okay? Now, the Ibn Ezra says, just above, it says that they came and they fought with Israel at Rephidim. So it would make sense to follow that with chapter 19 on the third month after the children of Israel had gone forth from the land of Egypt, because it then says, having journeyed from Rephidim, they came to the Sinai desert. All right, let's just do this slowly so we see. Remember now, the battle with Amalek, this nation that attacked Israel on their way out, is at the end of chapter 17, and it happens in Rephidim, okay? Then we get to Yitro and we read the Jethro story, and it's all of chapter 18, right? All of this advice that we just read, Jethro showing up. And then in chapter 19, it says, on the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day, they entered the wilderness of Sinai, V'yisum Rephidim, and they had journeyed from Rephidim. Okay? There's that same town. So, says the Ibn Ezra, it's clear that the Torah's actual narrative is they left Egypt, they fought Amalek, and then they went to Mount Sinai for the great revelation. The Jethro story, just if you look at those place names, seems like it's suddenly stuck in here. It's an interruption, at least in narrative. And the Ibn Ezra suggests it's not just an interruption in the narrative, it is actually it's a story taken from the future and placed into the narrative. So let me just show you what he means, and then I'm going to turn it out to the group to make sense of it. But what he says is that others have said, now Rav Sadia Gaon said that Jethro came to the Sinai desert before the giving of the Torah. But in my opinion, he only came in the second year after the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, because it says in this chapter that he offered an olah and other sacrifices to God. And it never says that they built an altar. It also says, I informed them of the laws and teachings of God. That's what Moses said. When Jethro is saying, what are you doing? Moses said, well, I informed them of the laws and teachings of God. That sounds like there are laws and teachings already. That has to be after the giving of the Torah, the Ibn Ezra says, and further proves my position. And it also says, and this is maybe the biggest evidence of all, it says Jethro came where Moses was camped at the mountain of God. Look, Moses was camped at the mountain of God. And remember, it was in chapter 19 that they went and they camped there in front of the mountain, right? Okay, so it's a little like a little bit technical, but I think you see the problem, and the Ibn Ezra therefore claims this whole story that we read about Jethro is a story that takes place after Mount Sinai and is actually Jethro advising Moses not on just sort of how to deal with these people in general, but how now to implement the judicial system suggested by the laws of the Torah. Okay, so that at least is one big question to consider, and I want to turn to you and ask you: which of these interpretations seems correct to you? Should we read this story as a before the Torah was given story, or should we read it as an after the Torah was given story? Are you convinced by the Ibn Ezra's logic? Okay, so let's just start there, and of course we have to ask, what would be the meaning of one or another interpretation? Okay, let's turn to Alexandra.
So I don't necessarily buy into the Ibn Ezra's interpretation. I think there's another one that to me is more like emotionally resonant, which is that the power of the Jethro story is about humility, and that wisdom can come from all sources, and it's not just Jews who are imbued with knowledge of God. It's people who seek a path of God. And so Yonatan made an amazing point that he had an earlier name previously, or she had a different, or she has another father as well. And I thought those were brilliant points. And I'm wondering, there's sort of a thematic thing that people who are prophets often change their name. And Jethro says something as appointed to God, or as God explains. And I think that what's powerful about this story to me is that the possibility that there are people who don't have the credentials, who don't have the pedigree, who have wisdom from God. And that Moses was encamped at on the base of God's mountain, Ibn Ezra's description. That could be a metaphor, it doesn't have to be literal. So I don't buy his argument full out. And to me, it sort of detracts from what I think is so powerful, in that we should learn from everyone, not just the Jews.
Okay, beautiful. Alexandra does both things, gives us a chronology, but also a reason for that chronology. Alexandra wants to read the Torah sort of as it presents itself in order. And this, by the way, what we're doing today is a recurring and major debate in the commentaries. Should we read the Torah in order, or lo mukdamu muchar b'Torah? Is there no before and after in the Torah? It's a kind of like modern kind of filmmaking, like flashbacks, flash forwards kind of a narrative. But Alexandra wants to read it in order, and part of why she wants to read it in order is because she sees the point of the story as as a reminder that there are people, there's wisdom everywhere, and not just wisdom, divine wisdom everywhere. And this Jethro isn't just a commentary on the revelation. Oh, you just had a revelation? Well, I've got a few suggestions. Rather, before we even get to the revelation, know that you can find divine wisdom from everywhere, and certainly from other nations, from the non-Jews as well. So yes, you will get this revelation from God, and that will be your covenant, but just know you should keep yourself open to wisdom, as Moses did. Okay, great. Matt Silberstein.
I just finished reading and don't quite remember all of Art of Biblical Narrative. And he goes to a big part about how the Judah interruption in the story is deliberate. Yes, it's this other story taken from someplace else and put in, but it's meant as commentary on what's going on. Mm-hmm. That it's not an accidental or somebody needed to put it in, but they are talking. And I think this is maybe even commentary on the Amalek story, on what's going on there. I don't have a full thought here. I don't know what the Torah is saying about Amalek, but I think this is put in the middle of an otherwise smooth narrative to tell us to look at the thing we just did.
Great.
Great.
We
do. So actually, I don't think it's necessarily about Sinai, but we have to keep Amalek in mind here.
Okay, great. So Matt is essentially following the advice of the Ibn Ezra here, the commentary we've just looked at, and saying, yeah, like the Ibn Ezra, I think it's fair to see this chapter as having taken place at a different time, but inserted purposefully here. And Matt gives another example, chapter 38 in the book of Genesis, which also feels like a flash forward or a flash to a different place, the story of Judah. So Matt concurs with the Ibn Ezra in the chronology, but also the reason that Matt just gave is in fact the reason that the Ibn Ezra will give, right? Because we have to, Ibn Ezra provided several pieces of evidence why he wanted to see this story as having taken place after the giving of the Torah. A little, we saw it, they're camped at the mountain of God. But then the Ibn Ezra has to answer the question, well, so then why is it stuck in here before the story? And look at the answer he gives, which actually I think is quite beautiful. And it's very similar to what Matt just said. He says, so there's an ellipses here, right? Because he goes on and on and on, and I recommend it. He just really works with all of the different names of Jethro and all the different appearances, and just does a beautiful job of synthesizing it all. And then finally says, Va'ata efaresh lama nichnasa parsha yitro b'makom hazeh. Now I will explain why the story of Jethro was inserted here. It is because the Torah mentions above all of the evil that Amalek had done to Israel. So now it mentions in contrast all the good that Jethro did for Israel. It's a remarkable thing to say, right? The Ibn Ezra seems to be saying here, we left Egypt and then immediately encountered another nation and they attacked us. And so it would be very easy for us readers of the Torah to start thinking, oh, the non-Jews are bad. Look at all the other nations, they are evil. So the Torah rushes in with Jethro to say, no, remember, Moses married into a good non-Jewish family. And not only that, but look at, okay, we're going to have to take this story from a little bit later, but you should know right now that the experiences with other nations can be treacherous, but they can be magnificent. Okay, so that is Matt and Ibn Ezra's way of making sense of this sort of flash forward. All right, let's take a couple of other answers, and then I want to get to the other question, which is where Jethro went. Payam, and then Maggie.
I think it's narratively here for a different reason. I think it's narratively here because it's foreshadowing. And what it's foreshadowing is the story of when Moses first goes up for the first set of tablets. And if you put the two stories next to each other, when Moses first goes up, the issue is he's gone and the people don't have a leader. And because they don't have a leader, they worship the golden calf, which is the same problem that Jethro right now told Moses, that the people need to order themselves. And if you don't have that order, then this is what's going to fall, which is exactly what happens when Moses first goes up to the golden calf. So it's foreshadowing the golden calf story about not having a singular leader and needing to have a structure, which is exactly what then the prescription is for the golden calf.
Yeah, I like that. That Payam's reminding us there's a continuing tension in the narrative of Exodus where the people are sort of dependent on Moses, but immediately ready to rebel against Moses, and because it seems they are in constant fear and chaos. And Jethro, in a way, provides a remedy to that. Says, let's get this society, or let's distribute power, because when all the power is invested in one figure, that's dangerous. And Payam says, you're going to see that play out. That problem ends up erupting later. And so we're seeing now how, it's like a warning, be careful. It's true, Jethro said this after, but this is the important thing that you're going to need to keep in mind as you begin to build this society, and they're not going to. So we'll have this sort of as a warning in the back of our heads. Maggie?
Going on with what Payam and Alexandra said, to me, this is the first time I've thought of this, isn't it possible that Yitro is one of the very few non-Jewish prophets? So reading it in chronological order, wouldn't he be prophetizing what's bound to happen?
Yeah, I mean, not only might we see Jethro as having some sort of connection to the divine, but there's another figure in the Torah who gets another non-Jewish figure in the Torah gets a Parsha named after him, who is explicitly a foreign prophet. Or actually, you know what? He doesn't get the Parsha named after him. The Parsha is named after the wicked king who hires him, Balak. But the Parsha is about Bilam, the foreign prophet. So again, we see that there's this idea out there that there are other nations that have their channel to God, and I have to say it's a good it's a helpful reminder, Maggie, because that I think is part of what we're dealing with in the Jethro story. Like, we who are more universalists love the idea that wisdom comes from everywhere, but the rabbis who lived in a more tribal society were always a little uncomfortable with the idea that these foreigners come along and seem to have Torah that we don't have. Like, what's going on with that, right? So it's like, that's part of the tension that we're trying to kind of unearth here. Okay, Yonatan, and then we'll move forward.
Yeah, I like the concept of Jethro being here as a non-Jewish good person / prophet / whatever you'd like to call him. I don't think you need to read the story out of order for that to be there. And frankly, I think the Ibn Ezra's arguments are really weak. The chronology that the Torah supports in order is the Israelites left Rephidim, they camped at Mount Sinai, Jethro came, and then there was divine revelation. And there's no breaking of the chronology there. The idea that, Moses had to explain the mitzvot. Well, by this point, even before the revelation at Sinai, we had gotten 4 mitzvot already. So it's not like there were 0 mitzvot. There may have also been ad hoc revelations that weren't included in the text. And what was his second argument? That
they're camped at the mountain of God. They make sacrifices. How did they have,
they hadn't built
little
the
details
we know that they offered olot right after the revelation at Sinai, right? So like, why do you have to wait until 2 years after the Mishkan was
right.
built to offer an olah, right? So like, all of these arguments I feel are really designed to force a point that isn't in the text.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally fair and squares with the other kind of like half of the commentators, right? What Rashi says Jethro heard, what did Jethro hear? Jethro heard about the war with Amalek and the parting of the Red Sea. There's plenty to hear about. There's plenty of reason to show up now, right? And it is, and Yonatan's underlying point is always worth considering, that it's always best, if you can, to read the Torah in order. Why would you choose to read it as a jumping around narrative, especially when, as Yonatan says, you can get a lot of the deep meaning that we've been considering without having to see this out of order. Okay, all right. But my point here, and I wanted to start with this, is just that it changes our sense of what Jethro is doing and how Jethro is offering wisdom or advice. If Jethro is showing up as a kind of commentary on what's just happened with the Torah, it changes. That's different than the idea of Jethro who shows up and provides a kind of a template for thinking about law altogether, right? So it's like a different way that we might encounter Jethro or receive Jethro. But now I want to look at another question that I think is less frequently considered, but to me even more perplexing, and that is not when did Jethro come, but where did Jethro go? And did Jethro go at all? And let me make the point here in the text, because the Jethro story ends, right? We read this. Moses' father-in-law says it isn't right, gives him all this advice, and they choose the thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, and they judge the people. And then the last line is very explicit. Vayishlach Moshe et chotno vayelech lo el artzo. Moses bade his father-in-law farewell, and he went his way to his own land. Okay, the end. Except that things get complicated when Jethro seems to come back in the book of Numbers. Okay, so Jethro went his way to his own land, but in the book of Numbers, which picks up in the second year after after they got the Torah. Here, actually, I will just even show you this because I do like I like the ability to not just say things, but with Safari here to show you them in the text. And I'm just going to go to the first chapter. Here's the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers starts on the first day of the second month in the second year following the Exodus from the land of Egypt. Right? So that's the book of Numbers. And in the book of Numbers, which takes place after the Torah, and this, by the way, is part of why the Ibn Ezra wanted to read the story of Jethro as taking place after the Torah, is that suddenly he pops up again in the book of Numbers, and that seems to take place after the Torah. So take a look at this exchange here. It's very mysterious why it's here all together, and it seems to be a kind of reconsidering of the moment of Jethro's departure. So Moses said, oh, and here we get another name for Jethro, Chovav ben Reuel. Okay, so that's that. All right, just so like if things weren't complicated enough, we're not calling him Jethro in this scene. Okay, so Moses said to Chovav, son of Reuel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, "We are setting out for the place of which the Eternal has said, I will give it to you, and that is the land of Canaan, Israel. Come with us, and we will be generous with you, for the Eternal has promised to be generous to Israel." And this is like, it's like we get a lot of very rich dialogue here. "I will not go," he replied to him, "but will return to my native land." And this is very Abraham language here. "Lo elech ki im el artzi ve'el moladati elech." Okay, so no, that's it. And that's fine. We already heard that Moses sent Jethro back home. But then Moses continues. He said, "Please do not leave us, inasmuch as you know where we should camp in the wilderness and can be our guide. So if you come with us, we will extend to you the same bounty that the Eternal grants us," meaning you'll also have a place in the land of Israel. And that's it. That's it. That's all the dialogue we get. So this wasn't there in the first part of the story. Moses just sent Jethro back. But in this story, Moses' father-in-law, Chovav, starts to go home, and Moses implores him to stay. And Jethro says no, and Moses says, "Please stay." And then I don't know. The next thing we read is they traveled from the mountain of the Eternal a distance of 3 days. In other words, I don't know, there's room to read this as Jethro agreed. Jethro went with them, right? So what do you think? What is this story? How do we make sense of this story? Earlier, I just showed this one more time, I'm sorry. I just want to show one more time just so everybody has it in their sight. We read just before that Moses bade his father-in-law farewell and went away to his own land. And now we have this whole, I don't know, what is it? What is this? Is it a zoom in? Are we getting like the dialogue that happened before Moses sent his father-in-law away, where Moses really tried to get him to stay? Or is this a hint that actually Jethro came back and Moses didn't? What is going on here? Let's see, Pam Dorman.
So I have a question. Is this a matter of different editors? And so it's different tellings of the story. But my other thought is, if we look at it sort of the way it is, I also, Jethro in this week's Parsha heard what had happened, and he was a priest in Midian. So he had a God that he worshiped. And at that time, Israelites accepted that other nations had other gods. We have our God. And so is this that Yitro heard about a very powerful God? Yitro wants to align with that powerful God, even if he's going to continue to worship his God. So,
yeah. Okay, so right. So Pam reminds us of something we alluded to at the outset, which is that, this, of all the stories of the Torah, can be easily easily analyzed through the lens of biblical criticism, right? Like there's one approach here, which is just to say these are two fragments from two stories of Moses' father-in-law, and they just have different endings. And I don't know, the editor kind of, I don't know, didn't notice that, but as you know, like I would like to consider the Torah as a whole, not just because I'm trying to shove my theological assumptions on you, but just because there was an editor, at least, whether it's God, Moses, or the redactor. And so we have to make some sense of what we, the receivers of the Torah, are supposed to be doing with these two stories. Like Jethro left, and then all of a sudden Jethro's back. Now, okay, so that's one way to think of it, and this is what Nachmanides says, is that, yes, Jethro left, and then showed up again, it bumped, right? This is the Sinai Desert, and Jethro is one of the big players in the Sinai Desert, and eventually they circle back to his troop, and this time Moses says, please, we need you, right? Things are getting bad here in the desert, and we need your eyes, right? And Jethro says, and even then, Jethro says no, but Moses implores him. Does Jethro stay? Right? That's one way of looking at it. Or maybe Jethro never left altogether, and this is like oh, you thought Jethro left, but actually part two, Jethro never left? Right? What's going on here? I see my mother has her hand up. She says, I have a question. I'm a little confused about the father-in-law. Did he go back to his own, or did he change his mind to stay with Moses? Right. That's the question. That's the question. Did Moses manage to convince Jethro to stay? Right. One way of looking at this story is, as my mom is looking at the story, is one way of looking at the story is to say that this is the story of Jethro wanting to leave and Moses saying, wait a minute, before you go, we really need you. And then it says they traveled together. So maybe they stayed together. Like maybe the point of the story in the book of Numbers is, guess what? Jethro really stayed and became a part of our collective, right? So what do you think? What do you think? Hal?
Yeah, I mean, so this has more to do with just the slightly larger context. And, you know, a question that occurs to me is, well, so were the Midianites important strategically to the Hebrews during this period? I mean, you know, because if you think about not only the children of Israel being the audience for this narrative, but also the Midianites. I mean, you know, there's a kind of making nice and valorization of them from our text, and I just wonder whether that had any basis in the historical circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I'm no history buff, but I will say that textually, the Midianites show up later in the book of Numbers, and they show up in the context of battle. Srorat HaMidyanim, go to war with the Midianites. So now that's kind of weird if Moses' father-in-law was a Midianite, although the Midian seems to be a huge region, which could mean lots of different things, a huge empire. But you're reminding us of it here, Hal, does force us to consider whether Jethro staying was a way of defecting from the Midianites, perhaps, or Moses saying, hey, ally with us, even if he didn't stay, ally with us instead of allying with the Midianites, right? Like there's something, not sure. But I will give you one of the commentators, I think, kind of like brilliant way of resolve. This is a dilemma, right? It's like we don't know exactly how to square away these two endings to the story, and are they the same story or are they two different stories? But the Sforno, an Italian commentator from the Renaissance period, gives us this answer, which I think is quite ingenious. And he gives us an answer by reminding us that Jethro, or at least mention of Jethro, shows up again in the Hebrew Bible. So again, Moses says to Jethro, please do not leave us, inasmuch as you know where we should camp in the wilderness and can be our guide. Right? And the Sforno reads that, please do not leave us, at least allow your children to go with us. For you know where we camp in the wilderness, which he means, by which he understands, if your children depart along also, you will be desecrating the name of the Eternal among the nations, as they will say, if Jethro would have seen any merit in this religion, surely he and his sons would not have abandoned them. Both Jethro and his sons agreed with this argument of Moses, so that in the end, only Jethro returned to his country, as we know from Exodus. So yes, Jethro did go back. Moses saw his father-in-law Yitro off, and he went by himself back to his own country. But there's no question that his children remained with Israel, as the book of Judges testifies when writing about, and this is true, the book of Judges mentions a group of people, the children of the Canaanite, the father-in-law of Moses, having previously ascended from the city of palms with the tribe of Judah. Okay, these commentators, they don't miss a thing. And Sforno gives us kind of like splits the difference and says, sure, Jethro went home, but there was somebody must have come with the Israelites, and maybe Jethro said, I'll tell you what, these sons of mine will stay with you, and they'll ally with you, or they'll become a part of you. And we see that they remained with Israel. But what I think is really important about the Sforno's commentary here is that he reveals the underlying motivation to see Jethro as staying with Israel. And that is that we, on the one hand, we can't really imagine that some foreigner comes and gives us basically the rules for how to live out our Torah. That rabbis have a hard time with, right? They're like trying to process that. But then on the other hand, we can't imagine that a foreigner comes, sees our whole connection to God, our revelation, everything, and then it's just like, that's fine. I hear some good advice. I'm going back to my own people where I belong. It's like, no, you can't. What do you mean? Like, this is the greatest religion of all time. Like, how could you not be interested in this? And so the commentators are kind of struggling, and maybe the Torah itself is struggling. Kind of see Jethro as, perhaps, if you're so great, then you should be one of ours. You should stay with us, right? There's something about it that is like not there's something about it's not like open-minded and tolerant, right? Because in order to be good, you have to be Israelite. There's no consent, but there's something about it that is that does recognize that Jethro is this incredible human, so great that of course he is a source of wisdom, and so much so that like we want to absorb him into our narrative, right? Okay, so you see here how like it's not quite clear where Jethro went, and again there are implications. What does it mean if Jethro left us? What does it mean if Jethro stayed? So let's just consider those implications for one more moment before we look at a final twist. Alexandra?
To me, the question is so heartbreaking because I'm feeling like it's Jethro's own sort of question, like, where does he belong? Who is he? Where are his loyalties? Where is his home? And to me, that's how I'm reading it, that it's his sort of own not knowing where to go and what to do and where he belongs.
Yeah, that's interesting. There is a part of what we've been looking at this kind of like looking at the big picture, but there's a lot of reflection to be done around just sort of like, who is this guy? And what is he thinking and feeling? What does he care about? And when he says, no, I got to go back to my own land, like, what does that mean for him? Like who? And when he brings Moses' wife and sons, those are his daughter and grandchildren. What does that mean for him? And what does it mean for him to leave them? Right? There's a personal drama here, right? Behind the like, what does this mean for us and our revelation? It's so easy to talk about this in the context of Revelation because there's Jethro right before the great event, but it's also like the story of a family, and the patriarch of a family kind of helping in the way that a grandfather does, but like having his own story. Hannah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about when Yitro says to Moshe, you know, you shouldn't be arbitrating all this on your own, right? You need to outsource it somehow. And I've thought a lot this week about what that means and what does it say about Moshe. But this changes it in some ways, because part of me now wonders, is he sort of appeasing him? Like, is he trying to say, like, there's still space for you here, you're welcome here, your input and your insight are part of why we want you to continue to be part of us, as opposed to some other readings of it. Like, I've often thought, oh, I don't know, like Moshe's still open and humble and willing to take advice. But now I'm wondering, does he agree, or is he just saying, like, we want you to love this the way that we do, and if you say something, I want to agree with that because I want people to feel welcome. And maybe that's part of good leadership also. Maybe that's some kind, like that kind of validation, that kind of inclusion maybe allows Yitro and other people to feel like they have a say in the way that the society is being created, and therefore if you have a stake in it, then you wouldn't leave. Like, you wouldn't
Right.
need to leave.
Yeah, right. I mean, what's Moses' motivation here also? What does Moses want here? And as Hannah says, you know, what Moses says is, you know where to camp in the desert, you know, like, you'll be our eyes, you're a good scout. But like, if we read it, that we want to read it in light of the earlier story. Like, you knew how to build an entire justice system. We desperately need you, right? And if not for you, we would have been a mess before we ever arrived. So isn't that right? Is it that Moses is saying, hey, you're my father-in-law, you're one of us, like, this is an open tent, right? Or is Moses saying, no, please don't go, you're Jethro, you're the person who told me how to judge disputes, right? Okay, having considered that, you know, Jethro's advice, let me just throw one last twist into the mix here. No, there isn't another appearance of Jethro. Actually, the scene that I want to give you is a scene distinctly without reference to Jethro, at least not direct reference to Jethro. But after all this sort of uncertainty, this questioning of when did Jethro come and where did Jethro go? Okay, when we start the book of Deuteronomy, last book of the Torah, and Moses gives his big speech, it's only 9 lines in before Moses says the following. And I think this will sound familiar to you, but also odd. Because Moses said, then I said to you, to the Israelite people, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. The eternal your God has multiplied you until you are today as numerous as the stars in the sky. May the eternal, the God of your fathers, increase your numbers 1,000-fold and bless you as God promised you. Hooray. How can I bear unaided the trouble of you and the burden and the bickering? So pick from each of your tribes men who are wise, discerning, and experienced, and I will appoint them as your heads. You answered me and said, what you propose to do is good. So I took your tribal leaders, wise and experienced men, and appointed them heads over you, chiefs of thousands, chiefs of hundreds, chiefs of 50s, and chiefs of 10s, officials for your tribes. Does this language here at the end sound familiar to you? Yeah, it does, doesn't it? That was Jethro's advice. Chiefs of thousands, hundreds, 50s, and 10s. Sorry, chiefs of... Okay, but now, who told the people to do that? Moses. Moses came up with this idea, and he told it to the people, and the people said, good idea. Great idea. Moses, you're so smart. How did you come up with this entire justice system? He didn't come up with it. Jethro came up with it. What's going on here? How do we read this? This is sort of like a mysterious kind of non-conclusion to the story. It's like, okay, we've got all those unanswered questions about Jethro, and is Jethro with us? Did Jethro go back? And suddenly Moses retells the story and leaves Jethro out and claims all the credit for himself. Okay, that's at least one reading. What do you make of this? How does this resolve or not resolve everything we've been talking about so far? Yeah, El?
Well, I don't have how this resolves everything, but one thing that I've noticed from the beginning, being a mother-in-law, I was moved, and I acknowledged the fact that Moses listened to his father-in-law. His father-in-law had the nerve to come up with this suggestion and tell him, you're not doing this right, here's a better idea. But Moses, in his famous sniut, in his famous modesty, said, you're right. And that's an interaction that's unique. And so I just wanted to bring this out, that every time I hear about Moses' interactions and his modesty, this modesty that he had from the beginning, when God said, I want you to do this, and he said, oh no, God, I can't handle this. I'm not enough for that. He listened. So that was a great wisdom on his part.
Okay, this is great. This is a very important comment as we ask this last question, like what is Moses doing in the book of Deuteronomy? Because the whole point of this story, Yael reminds us well, is that Moses immediately listened and did everything Jethro said. So it felt at that moment, and then we have another story of Moses begging him to stay. So it's not so easy just to say like, Moses took credit for it himself. Moses left Jethro out of the story. It's like that wasn't the vibe that we were getting from Moses all along, right? David Kurtz?
There are lots of gods out there, obviously. It's all over the Bible. One of the most revolutionary things about this is that, about this whole story, is that this God moves. All the gods were regional, they stayed in their area, and people didn't leave their area. Areas were named for the gods, blah, 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 blah. So it was quite revolutionary, and yet Yitro is the character that is in the past, and it, has that kind of, has the community set up like that. I mean, Moses, as we just said, didn't disregard Yitro, but they're on the move, and he's trying to show him that this God moves. This God is with you, he's universal, he's everywhere, and that's a very hard concept for people to have understood back then.
Yeah, that's interesting. It isn't,
And
in
maybe,
other words, it isn't just about the mountain, right? Like it's not just about that experience, that place. If Jethro showed up at the mountain, right? Imagine the Ibn Ezra says that Jethro heard about the revelation and came and it's like, wow, this is the mountain. Look, it's the mountain. And maybe David Kurtz imagines a kind of a different conversation where Moses does a little educating, like, no, it works a little differently with our God. Our God isn't rooted in a place, like, come and join us on our journey and our God will be with us always. And maybe Jethro doesn't totally get that because he has his own religious tradition, right? And he has a different way of thinking about God.
Scary. Yeah, it's scary to him.
It's scary to him, right? That I appreciate. That's sort of a last minute, like, and an important kind of parallel narrative to think about is, how might Jethro not just be the wise outsider, but also the curious and uncertain outsider that maybe Moses is trying to say, no, really, you are great. You can think of a justice system. You should really get into our God, because our God is right. And there's a conversation, like there's a negotiation there. And I think that's where we haven't answered any of these questions, but we sort of leave in like with that negotiation kind of still taking place in the Torah, among the commentators, and on through our own history and into modernity. And the conversation is around, like, how do we, the Jewish people, regard all of the other peoples of the world? Are they our friends? Are they our family? Are they our advisors? Let us not forget, after all, that Moses married into the family of a priest from Midian, right? Our greatest prophet was married to a nice non-Jewish girl, right? So, like, from the start, there's something a little bit like different about the whole kind of Jewish, non-Jewish paradigm that we've kind of gotten used to operating with. And what there are many ways to answer the questions that we've been posing today, the where did Jethro come from, but all of them are kind of moving around these questions of what do we do with someone who so clearly seems to be one of our teachers, one of our friends, one of our beloveds, who nevertheless has his own story. Do we let him have his own story and just thank him and wish him well? Or do we try to bring him into our story? Because if it's divine truth, we want it in our tent, right? So that's really the overlying tension. And you know, and whatever else is true, the Ibn Ezra is right about this, that the Torah does take its time to really present the story of this outsider as the preface to our greatest revelation, right? Just never forget that the Parsha named, the Parsha that is about our greatest moment of divine encounter is named for somebody from another faith tradition. And that in itself is something that is worth reflecting on, meditating on, and keeping with us as we continue to try and figure out how our faith interacts and intersects with all of the peoples of the world. So we'll leave it there. I see hands up, so sorry not to call on everybody today, but I think we're out of time, and I'll see you next week.